To enjoy this episode of Forensic Tales ad-free, check us out on Patreon. Patreon.com/Forensic Tales.
Forensic Tales discusses topics that some listeners may find disturbing. The contents of this episode may not be suitable for everyone. Listener discretion is advised.
On the evening of May 5th, 1993, three 8-year-old boys disappeared from their neighborhood in West Memphis, Arkansas. By the next day, their bodies were found in an area known as Robin Hood Hills. The crime was brutal, the community was horrified, and within weeks, police announced they had their suspects. But this case wouldn't be solved with DNA. There were no fingerprints, no blood evidence, no eyewitnesses placing anyone at the scene. Instead, the case against three teenage boys would be built on a confession filled with factual errors, questionable forensic testimony, and a growing belief that the murders had something to do with a satanic ritual. This is Forensic Tales, episode 319, The West Memphis Three.
Before we get into the story, it's important to talk about the victims in this case, the boys who never came home. On May 5th, 1993, Steve Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers, all just 8 years old, were reported missing by their families after they failed to return home that night. All three were reported missing hours after they left Weaver Elementary School, and all three boys lived with their families in West Memphis, Arkansas. Steve Branch was born to parents Stephen and Pamela Branch, but when he was just an infant, his mom divorced his biological father and eventually married a man named Terry Hobbs. He also had a 4-year-old stepsister named Amanda. Christopher Byers was born to parents Melissa Defer and Ricky Murray. And like Steve, his parents also divorced when he was younger. He was just 4 years old. Then shortly after that, his mom married John Byers, who legally adopted Christopher. He also had a stepbrother named Sean Clark, who was 13 in 1993. James Michael Moore, who went by his middle name, Michael. He was considered the leader of the three. He lived with his parents, Todd and Dana Moore, and his 9-year-old sister, Dawn. It's hard to imagine. They were just 8 years old when they disappeared. The first to call the police was Christopher's adoptive father, John Byers. He alerted the authorities that his son hadn't come home sometime around 7 p.m. The boys were last seen playing together about 30 minutes earlier at 6:30 p.m. This was around the same time Steve's stepfather saw them and called for him to come inside. After that, the boys were just gone, never to be seen alive again. It was completely out of character for them to be somewhere without telling their parents first. So search efforts began almost immediately. By morning, they were still missing. During the first few hours, the search was conducted by friends and family of the missing boys. But by the morning of May 6th, the West Memphis Police Department was fully on board. They would eventually search the entire West Memphis area, but they primarily focused on an area called Robin Hood Hills. This was where the boys were last seen. But despite a shoulder-to-shoulder search, they didn't find any sign of the boys that morning. It wasn't until hours later that they found something. At around 1:45, one of the searchers found a boy's black shoe floating in a muddy creek that led to a major drainage canal in Robin Hood Hills. This was the first big clue that they were looking in the right spot. Then not long after that discovery, the boys' bodies were discovered. Now, just to warn you, the details are graphic. And it's especially heartbreaking to know that we're talking about 8-year-old little boys here. But here's what happened. All three were found deceased inside that drainage ditch in Robin Hood Hills. They had been beaten and hogtied with their shoelaces. Their right ankles had been tied behind their backs to their right wrists, and their left ankles tied to their left wrists. They had been stripped naked, with most of their clothing found nearby turned inside out. Autopsies would later reveal that one of the boys died of multiple injuries and that the other two died of multiple injuries while drowning. So the boys had essentially been beaten to death and drowned, and that's still not even the worst part. There was also evidence that one of the boys had been mutilated, although that detail would later be disputed. At first, police suspected the boys had been sexually assaulted. Trace amounts of sperm DNA were found on a pair of pants recovered from the scene. But just like mutilation claims, that detail would also later be disputed. A crime like this completely shocked the West Memphis community. These were just 8-year-old little boys. But right away, the investigation had its issues. The first was that the West Memphis police hadn't really handled a crime like this before. There were 3 separate victims, a messy crime scene, a crime scene that had been exposed to water, wildlife, and the elements for almost 24 hours. This was a crime scene they had never dealt with before. And even when the local police were offered assistance from violent crime experts from within the Arkansas State Police, they refused. They didn't accept any outside help from any other law enforcement. They wanted to handle this all by themselves. Much later on, that decision would be highly criticized. Why wouldn't they want help from the state police? This was a very big and high-profile case with a lot of moving parts. Well, according to some, the local police didn't want the state police's help because they were under investigation for suspected theft from the county's drug task force. Now, to be clear, I wasn't able to find definitive proof of that. But that's what sources have said. Whatever the reason, the local police took charge of the investigation. And from the beginning, they made a lot of mistakes when it came to processing the evidence. They simply didn't have the tools or resources to properly collect and preserve forensic evidence. In fact, it wasn't until 8 days later that the crime lab was called to the scene where the bodies had been found. 8 days. So during that time, a lot of physical and forensic evidence was simply lost. In a case like this, the crime lab needed to be there within hours, not days, especially when we're talking about a case that's outdoors. Evidence is lost in the blink of an eye if the right people aren't on scene right away. And that wasn't the only issue. By the time proper forensic equipment arrived, the area had already been disturbed in more ways than one. Wildlife dominated the area. Officers had stepped through the crime scene. Things were moved. Nothing about the scene was in its original place or condition, so that meant everything. Potential fingerprints, footwear impressions, trace evidence, even biological material had probably already been destroyed or contaminated. The crime scene problems didn't stop there. The police were never able to establish a timeline of when each injury occurred. They also had no reliable way to know which injury came from exposure to the elements or which was inflicted by the killer or killers. Much later at trial, prosecutors claimed that one of the boys had been mutilated. They specifically argued that he had been castrated by the killers. But experts for the defense argued that didn't happen. They believed the injuries were the result of post-mortem animal activity. Without a secure crime scene, how can you say which version is true? Second, the police reported that the boys had bite marks on them. But that's something else they challenged. They thought that all the bite marks were made after death. They also argued that they weren't even human bite marks. They were most likely from animals in the area, like turtles or fish. But even if the defense was wrong and they were actual human bite marks, none of the suspects who were arrested had bite marks that matched the impressions that were found on the boys. All 3 men had teeth impressions taken and none of them matched. Also interesting, the boys had strange scratch marks that no one could explain. Well, one of the defense experts argued that the marks likely came from turtles. Turtles sometimes dig their arms and legs into a food source to gain traction while they're eating. Next point. The police said the boys had been assaulted and killed at the same location where their bodies were found. But a lot of critics don't believe that. It's more likely that the murders happened somewhere nearby and the location of the bodies was just the dump site. But none of these claims were something the police considered or were able to determine. Because forensic experts and crime scene investigators weren't on scene until days later, it's almost impossible to say how and when each boy suffered their injuries. Was it sexual mutilation, or were the wounds a result of animal activity? I don't think anyone can say for sure at this point because of how poorly the scene was handled. And when you're trying to solve a triple homicide, especially involving 3 very young victims, you're going to want all of those questions answered. But in this case, they didn't have any of it. If you think this sounds like a botched investigation already, you need to listen to this next part. The police were also slow to get the coroner there. The boys' bodies had been removed from the water even before the coroner arrived to examine the scene. The bodies were pulled from the creek and just laid out on the ground under the sun and exposed to insects. They didn't even call the coroner until almost 2 hours after the discovery of the floating shoe. So just imagine how much evidence and information was lost in that time frame. And when it came to the creek itself, that wasn't drained until days later. So whatever evidence might have been in the water was also lost or contaminated. Plus, there would be a lot of criticism for how the coroner even handled the case once they finally showed up. Some critics said they were, quote, extremely substandard. To give you an example of that, a small amount of blood had been found at the crime scene, but it was never tested. So instead of having reliable evidence, the police started coming up with their own theories that weren't rooted in the forensic evidence. Injuries were labeled as intentional mutilation. Ligatures were interpreted as ritualistic. And instead of asking what evidence could still be recovered, the focus quickly shifted to what the crime must have meant. And once that interpretation took hold, it shaped everything that followed. Because when a crime scene is misunderstood or overinterpreted, the investigation doesn't just drift off course, it locks in. And from that moment forward, the case wasn't about finding out who did this. It was about finding someone who fit what police already believed had happened. Very early on in the investigation, there were rumors that a satanic cult had to be responsible for the murders. Now, keep in mind, there was never any actual physical evidence of this. These were all just rumors and speculation. But here's why those rumors took hold so quickly. Number 1, the crime scene's location in the woods. If a satanic cult was behind this, they would commit their crime deep in the woods. Number 2, how the boys were naked. Number 3, the positioning of the boys' bodies. They were all hogtied. Number 4, the alleged bite marks. Maybe the marks were the result of some sadistic ritual or ceremony. Then finally, number 5, the rumors about one of the boys being sexually mutilated. More specifically, the police believed one of them had been intentionally castrated. The idea was that it was connected to some disturbed satanic ceremony. So within just a matter of a few days, the chief of police at the time, Gary Gitchell, informed the public that they were considering a number of possible explanations for the murders, including cult activity. So picture that for a moment. You hear about the brutal murder of 3 young boys. You learn about the awful details of how they were killed, and now you hear from the police that they believe a satanic cult was behind this. You can just imagine how disturbed people were about this case. And once these rumors made it out into the media, there was no stopping it. No one ever considered the possibility that the police were wrong about their theory. They also never considered other possible theories or motives. What if the boys were actually murdered by someone who knew them? Or what if they were just completely wrong with this whole Satan aspect? How damaging can tunnel vision be for a case like this? Unfortunately, There are killers out there who murder 8-year-old little boys. They don't have to be involved in some cult for that to happen. Sometimes it just happens. But once the cult theory took hold, the police stopped considering any other possibilities. And I don't think the court of public opinion forgot about it either.
Reaching your weight loss goals doesn't have to mean completely changing the way you live your life. What if you could make healthy progress with a treatment plan that included medication, access to 24/7 support, nutrition tips, and tools for tracking movement, hydration, and sleep, all personalized to go at your pace? That's weight loss by hers. They even offer the convenience of 100% online care with licensed providers who learn your story and create a personalized plan to deliver healthy progress you can maintain. So no more yo-yoing, just steady results. Feel like your best self again. Visit forhers.com/tales to get a personalized, affordable plan that gets you. That's forhers.com/tales. forhers.com/tales. Weight loss by hers is not available everywhere. Compounded drug products are not approved or evaluated for safety, effectiveness, or quality by the FDA. Prescription required. See website for full details, important safety information, and restrictions. Actual price depends on product and plan purchased.
Therapy can help, but sometimes it isn't the whole answer. Talkiatry gives you access to real psychiatric care with licensed clinicians who can diagnose and prescribe medication if it's right for you. It's a simple way to get effective treatment right from home. And as a busy podcaster and mom myself, the convenience is so important. What's even better is that all their 600 plus clinicians are in network with major insurers, so you can use your existing insurance instead of paying monthly subscriptions or out-of-network fees. It's a 100% online psychiatry practice that provides comprehensive evaluations, diagnoses, and ongoing medication management for conditions like ADHD, anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder, OCD, PTSD, insomnia, and more. Head to talkiatry.com/tales and complete the short assessment to get matched with an in-network psychiatrist in just a few minutes. That's talkiatry.com/tales to get matched in minutes. Besides the police, another supporter of this cult theory was a man named Jerry Driver. He was a juvenile probation officer at the time. And one of the people he had under his supervision was 18-year-old Damian Eccles, someone who would eventually become one of the 3 men arrested. Damian Eccles was on probation after being arrested for burglary and sexual misconduct. He also had past convictions for vandalism and shoplifting, and almost everything about Damian's background led to where he ended up. His family was very poor. Social workers were constantly visiting his house as a kid. He hardly ever went to school. In fact, he dropped out before ever graduating from high school. The only life he knew involved crime. So when Jerry Driver heard about the murders and the rumors about cult activity, he suspected Damian. Apparently, Jerry Driver was helping the police at the scene, and sometime while he was there, he said something like, "Oh, it looks like Damian Eccles finally killed someone." So within just a matter of moments, Damian Eccles was put on the suspect list. Not because they found any forensic evidence linked to him, but because of pure speculation and rumors. The probation officer said that the more he interacted with Damian while under his supervision, the more he became convinced that he was involved in some type of satanic cult. He just had a weird obsession with occultism. So just 2 days after the bodies were discovered, the police interviewed him. This all started because his probation officer pointed the finger at him and said he was interested in occultism. There was no physical evidence, there was no forensics. It was just a probation officer who pointed the finger at him. When questioned, Damian denied having any connection with Satanism, but he did admit to believing in and practicing magic. 2 days later, on May 9th, he was interviewed by police again. And this time, he reportedly made some incriminating statements. He told detectives that one of the victims had wounds to his private parts. Even though this information had been made public, the police took this statement as Damien incriminating himself. The second person the police looked at was 16-year-old Jason Baldwin. He popped up on the police's radar because he was good friends with Damien Echols. But even though they were good friends, the only thing they had in common was that they were both considered social outcasts. Unlike Damien, Jason had always done well in school and didn't join in Damien's fascination with magic. But despite their differences in personalities, they spent a lot of time together before this happened. The third suspect was 17-year-old Jesse Miskelly. What was strange was that he didn't have much connection to either Damien or Jason. They had gone to the same high school, but that was it. And the only connection he had to the murders was that he had babysat for a woman named Vicki Hutchinson, a woman who volunteered to help the police investigate. Let's talk about her now. Vicki Hutchinson was a local woman whose 8-year-old son had been friends with the victims. Early on, she told police that her son may have witnessed something related to the murders, but he was never able to identify who was responsible. Still, police stayed in contact with her. And at some point, during a conversation with investigators, Hutchison was told that Damien Echols had already been interviewed, and that's when she made an offer. Hutchison told officers she could play detective and offered to meet up with Damien Echols herself to see if she could get information out of him. Keep in mind, this woman has no police training. She hasn't offered any useful information to the investigation. She knows literally nothing. And instead of discouraging this, police just went along with it. With their encouragement, Hutchison enlisted the help of Jesse Miskelly Jr. Again, she knew him because he had babysat for her in the past. He also knew Damien Echols from high school, so he agreed to tag along. Hutchison later claimed that on May 19, 1993, the three of them went out to a nearby field where she said they encountered a, quote, gathering of witches. She alleged that the gathering turned sexual. She said there was an orgy, and that she eventually asked Echols to take her home, leaving Miss Kelly behind. She later told this story to police and reportedly passed a polygraph exam. But there were problems with her story. There was never any independent evidence to support her claims. No other witnesses, no physical evidence of this so-called story. And even worse, her story placed Jason Baldwin at the center of events only after Miss Kelly was later interrogated. About a month after the murders, the police interrogated Jesse on June 3rd. And right off the bat, there were issues with how that interrogation was conducted. Number 1, Jesse's mental capacity. At the time, his reported IQ was 72, which categorized him as borderline intellectual functioning. Issue number 2, he was a minor, he was only 17, and neither one of his parents was present for the interview with the police. Apparently, his father gave him permission to go with the police, but he didn't explicitly give them permission to question or interrogate him. And issue number 3, he never had an attorney present. So not only was he a minor and should have had his parents with him, but he didn't even have representation. On June 3rd, he was questioned for 12 hours, but only 46 minutes of that interview were recorded. The other 11 hours? There's no video or audio recording of it. According to police, Jesse confessed to the murders sometime during this interview. And even though he was informed of his Miranda rights, Jesse would later say he didn't understand them. And can you blame him? He's someone with a low IQ. He's a minor. He doesn't have an attorney or his parents with him. He's being questioned by police for 12 hours. I don't think he understands exactly what was going on. Well, to the authorities, he confessed to the murders. Not only did he implicate himself, but he also implicated the 2 other men. He said he was the one who helped restrain the boys, but it was actually the other 2 who committed the murders. Soon after, Jesse recanted his confession, saying he was scared of the police. He said he only told the police what he thought they wanted to hear. Nothing about his confession made sense. Pretty much his entire statement was inconsistent with the facts of the case. And the police knew about this, but went ahead with his confession anyway. In fact, while confessing, Jesse contradicted his own story multiple times. Within hours of Jesse's so-called confession, he was arrested. The police also arrested Jason Baldwin and Damian Eccles for the murders on June 3, 1993. And on August 4th, at their preliminary hearing, they all entered a plea of not guilty. The theory became that all three were involved in this devil worship cult that turned deadly. That was now the so-called West Memphis Three. Because Jesse Misskelley had confessed to police, he had his own trial. Then Jason and Damian were tried together, but while they all waited to go to trial, they sat in prison. There was no way out, even though all claimed to be innocent. And as you can imagine, the case drew a lot of media attention, not only because of the brutality of the murders, but also because of the satanic aspect. The public sentiment was that the West Memphis Three were guilty, but not everyone thought so. There were a few exceptions to the rule. A few people thought the police had made many mistakes along the way, and a lot of those mistakes had to do with the forensic evidence. Jesse Misskelley was the first to go to trial in late January 1994. They argued that almost everything he confessed to didn't match up with the facts of the case. Jesse Misskelley falsely claimed that the boys had been sexually assaulted. If you recall from earlier, the police believed the boys had been assaulted, but that fact turned out to be false. There was never any physical or forensic evidence of that. And number two, he said he helped tie the boys up with ropes. But that was simply not true. The boys were hogtied with their own shoelaces. They weren't tied up with rope. Well, the inconsistencies in his so-called confession didn't seem to bother the jury. That's because on February 4th, 1994, he was found guilty of first-degree and second-degree murder and was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. He became the first of the West Memphis Three to be convicted. The trial of Damian Eccles, who was seen as the trio's leader, and Jason Baldwin started shortly after. It all came down to Damian Eccles' interest in the occult. They told the jury he liked to read Stephen King novels and that he listened to Metallica. These were all things that made him a satanic killer. They also had a fellow inmate testify that Jason Baldwin had confessed to the murders. On top of that, 2 girls claimed to have heard Damian confess during a softball game. But the defense had a different strategy. They sought to introduce alternative suspects. Insert Mr. Bojangles. According to local West Memphis police officers on the night of May 5th, 1993, at around 8:42 p.m., workers inside the Bojangles restaurant, which was located about a mile from the crime scene, reported seeing a guy who seemed, quote, mentally disoriented inside the women's restroom. The man was also reportedly bleeding and had brushed against the restroom walls. But when the police finally responded to the call, the guy was long gone. And on top of that, the police never entered the ladies' restroom to inspect it for blood. The day after the victims' bodies were found, the restaurant's manager called the police, saying he thought there might be a connection to the murders and the guy bleeding in the bathroom. So the police went out and took some samples from the walls and tiles. But here's the bad news. The police detective who took the samples, Detective Brian Ridge, lost those blood scrapings. So we will never know whether they had any connection to the murders or not. And to this day, Mr. Bojangles has never been identified. On March 18th, 1994, Eccles and Baldwin were both found guilty of first-degree murder. Eccles was sentenced to the death penalty, and Baldwin received life in prison without the possibility of parole. The West Memphis Three were all sentenced to spend the rest of their lives behind bars. 2 months later, in May 1994, all 3 men filed appeals and all 3 were denied. In October 2003, there was another update. This time it involved Vicki Hutchinson, the wannabe detective. In 2003, she did an interview for the Arkansas Times in which she basically said that everything she said back then to the police wasn't true. She said she was coerced by the police into saying what she did. She also said the police threatened to take her child away. She made everything up. But the three remained in prison. Fast forward another few years to 2007. This was a big year for the West Memphis Three. In 2007, Damian Eccles petitioned for a retrial based on a statute permitting post-conviction testing of DNA evidence due to advances made since 1994. But that petition was also denied. But just because his petition was denied, that doesn't mean there wasn't DNA testing done. Later that year, testing was done on DNA that had been collected from the scene. None of it matched any of the West Memphis Three. They also tested a hair that was found in the knots used to bind the kids. That hair was found to be, quote, not inconsistent with Steve Branch's stepfather, Terry Hobbs. But none of these forensic findings were enough to release the men. Prosecutors stood behind the convictions. But that didn't mean the men stopped trying. In October of 2007, Damian Eccles once again filed paperwork seeking either a new trial or to be released following these findings. They specifically argued that DNA collected from the scene pointed to Terry Hobbs. The judge denied it, saying that the DNA tests were, quote, inconclusive. By late 2010, the West Memphis Three had been in prison for 16 years. Their attorneys had done everything. They claimed trial misconduct. They presented new evidence. They even challenged the ruling against the inclusion of evidence that they felt would be beneficial to their case. Over the years, something else happened that I don't think anyone expected. In July 2008, it was discovered that Kent Arnold, the jury foreman on the Eccles and Baldwin trial, had discussed the case with an attorney prior to the start of deliberations. For those of you who might be unaware, that is completely against the law. You can't consult with outside people while sitting on a jury, including an attorney. So in 2008, he was accused of basically advocating for the guilt of the West Memphis Three. He was also accused of sharing inadmissible evidence, like how Jesse Miskelly had confessed to the police. Some of you might think this would have warranted a new trial, but that isn't exactly what happened. It was, however, enough to persuade the courts to hold a hearing. Here's where things finally began to shift. On November 4th, 2010, after years and years of failed appeals, the Arkansas Supreme Court ordered a hearing. For the very first time, the court agreed to consider new forensic evidence. This was evidence that had the potential to exonerate the West Memphis Three. So preparations for that hearing moved quickly. The first thing that happened was that Damian Eccles brought on a new defense team. But as they began looking over things, they ran into a familiar problem. The new evidence, like the old evidence, didn't conclusively point to a different perpetrator. It raised serious doubts, but it was still largely circumstantial. And they knew that a hearing or even a new trial would be very risky. Patrick Benka, one of Damian's attorneys, had an existing professional relationship with Dustin McDaniel, who was serving as Arkansas's Attorney General at the time. So the two met privately to discuss the case. And during that meeting, Benka proposed skipping the hearing altogether and moving straight toward new trials. He essentially argued that the jury misconduct uncovered years earlier would almost certainly justify them. So McDaniel agreed to take the idea back to his team. And that's when negotiations took a different turn. Rather than gamble on new trials, which would expose the state to embarrassment and the defendants to life sentences, or worse, both sides talked about a compromise, an Alford plea. With this type of plea, the West Memphis Three would plead guilty while maintaining on the record that they were innocent. They would only plead guilty because it was in their best legal interest. I know that idea sounds crazy on the surface. Why would you plead guilty to a crime you say you didn't commit? To be honest, there are a lot of reasons why someone might do that. And in this case, it was a smart move. But of course, it wasn't an easy decision. By this point, Jason Baldwin arguably had the most to lose. He had never confessed, he wasn't on death row, and accepting the plea would still mean a felony conviction. So for a moment, he hesitated. But there was another factor at play. Damien Echols was still facing the death penalty, and an execution date was quickly approaching. So in the end, Baldwin agreed to the plea, not for himself, but to save Echols' life. And on August 19th, 2011, Judge David Laser approved the agreement. All three men entered Alford pleas. They maintained their innocence, and all three were released on time served. After 18 years, one of the most controversial murder cases in American history came to a strange and deeply unsatisfying pause. Not with answers, not with justice, but with freedom and a case that still refuses to truly close. As part of the plea deals, the men can't pursue any type of legal action against the state, including claims for wrongful imprisonment. At the end of the day, they're legally guilty of the murders. Alford pleas are treated like guilty pleas for the most part, and that's the part that still troubles a lot of people. Because while the men were released, the convictions themselves were never overturned. That's 18 years behind bars. A permanent criminal record, and a legal outcome that left the murders of three little boys officially solved, even though many questions remain unanswered. So even though the Alford pleas brought an end to the legal process, I don't think they really brought closure. Not for the families of the three boys, and not for anyone still asking the most important question of all, who actually killed the boys in Robin Hood Hills? Back in 2007, we learned that none of the DNA evidence collected at the scene matched the West Memphis Three. In fact, it belonged to an unidentified male. So it's not impossible to imagine that new testing could lead to the identification of the person or people who actually committed the crime. We could also go back and test items that were once thought to be untestable. For instance, the boys' shoelaces that were used to tie them up. We have testing methods available today that weren't available back then that can test the laces for possible DNA. And that's yet another aspect to this case that makes it so frustrating, because the technology exists. Advances in forensic science have solved cases far older than this one, and yet the murders of 3 8-year-old boys remain officially solved, despite DNA that points away from the people convicted and towards someone who had never been identified. The West Memphis Three walked free, but I don't think the truth did. And as long as evidence remains untested, as long as questions remain unanswered, and as long as science is left on the sidelines, this case will continue to stand as a warning about what happens when fear overtakes facts, when confessions replace evidence, and when the desire to close a gap outweighs the responsibility to get it right. Because forensic science isn't just about proving guilt. It's about protecting the innocent and making sure the right person or people are held accountable. And until that happens, the story of the West Memphis Three and the boys who lost their lives in Robin Hood Hills is not truly over.
Forensic Tales is a Rockefeller audio production. The show is written and produced by me, Courtney Fretwell. If you'd like to help create compelling new cases, fund research, and assist with production and editing costs, you can support the show with a small monthly contribution. In return, you'll be one of the first to listen to new ad-free episodes and gain access to exclusive content. To learn more, visit patreon.com/Forensic Tales. Forensic Tales is a podcast made possible by our Patreon producers: Tony A., Christine B., Sherry A., Michael D., Nicola, Megan G., Ureli, Jerry, Ann F., Carol A., Shannon D., Marianne C., Lois B., Lynn H., Ashley H., Danielle D., Chrissy D., Brett R., Luz Raquel, and Christine K. If you'd like to become a producer of the show, head over to our Patreon page or send me an email at courtney@forensictales.com. For a complete list of sources used in this episode, please visit forensictales.com. Thank you for listening, and see you next week.
Until then, remember, not all stories have happy endings.